I'm Kari Borne from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services, and I've been doing so since 1983. And one of our favorite topics, of course, is politics and an election year. So we'll be covering that for this week and then 4 more weeks. Today's presenter is Dr. Keith Zukas. He's an associate professor who teaches journalism and communication courses such as writing and reporting for news media, sports journalism, introduction to public speaking, feature writing, public affairs reporting, cross-cultural communication, public opinion and communication, communication law, and new student seminar. But there's a lot more. That's just the classes. He is also the advisor to the Royal Purple newspaper. In that role, he guides students in the creation of editorial, advertising, and media content for print and online issues throughout the academic year. Zukas conducts numerous journalism and media research projects, contributing to knowledge in both qualitative and quantitative studies. With a focus in framing, he's particularly interested in textual and content analysis of newspaper coverage. He studies Wisconsin energy and environmental issues such as wind farming, fractured sand mining, and nuclear power. Before coming to UW-Whitewater, he worked at 2 different newspapers in Wisconsin, a magazine, and a book publishing company. Zukas has a passion for communication in the fields of journalism, strategic communication, and speech. His experience as a city, county journalist, campus reporter, strategic communications manager, event planner, and advertising assistant provided firsthand knowledge of how informative and strategic communications interact to create a dynamic mass communications society. Please welcome Dr. Keith Zukas.
Well, thank you very much, Director Borne and everyone here at Fairhaven for having me. I appreciate this opportunity, and it's quite an exciting time to be an American today, dealing with our elections and all of those things happening, and it's terrific that we can bridge a lot of the programming at the university and bring it out here. So as you just heard, I do have a lot of experience working in various parts of the media, so I like to bring a lot of my own practical experience and things that I can bring to the academic field, as well as with my research and things like that. So I'm excited to be here today to share a little bit of this with you, and kind of have a bit of a 2-part lecture here today. And if you do have questions, of course, feel free to raise your hand or let me know, and definitely answer them. Let me know if you can't hear me as well. But the first part of today is going to be a little bit of a trip back in time, a little bit of a trip back into history to talk about why communication, why the press is so important to begin with, and particularly in political contexts. And then we'll jump forward into the 20th century and today, now gosh, nearly almost 25 years into the 21st century, to talk about how we can work with press and politics today. So a little bit of a guide there for you. So again, let's maybe take a bit of a trip back in time and think about just, I always like to start with my classes to talk about the importance of communication, the importance and the ideas of being able to have free speech. And in free communication, that means the freedom to talk and also the freedom to receive information, right? So to get information. And to do that, we rely on the press a lot, right? So, oh gosh, back in like 600 AD, China developed one of the very first printing presses. A few hundred years later, we have the Gutenberg press in Germany. If we have any Lutherans in here, you might recall from your Bible studies, Martin Luther pounding, right, his demands for the Catholic Church on the door, saying, we need the Bible in German. People need to be able to read the Bible in their own language, right? If it's in Latin, how can we connect, truly with God and with our religion? So we see over the course of several hundred years, the importance and the need of information start to arise. Okay, we start to see pamphlets being distributed more and more throughout the world, and particularly in Europe. as these classes start to develop, we start to see this emerging middle class. Right? In France, this is called the bourgeoisie. Maybe you've heard the term bougie lately. It's kind of a pop term the young kids use. It actually comes from this phrase bourgeoisie, which means little better than, better than. It's this development of a middle class. So we have people who aren't quite the elites, but they're not the poor. And so they have an interest in society and the well-being of society, but they're not like the ruling monarchy. And so in public houses and in Western Europe, in French salons and in these types of spaces, we see this middle class emerging and wanting this information. We see the development of printing presses. We see the development of more books and literature, right? But at the same time, so much of this is government controlled, right? So much is controlled by the church and controlled by the monarchy. We need to have official royalty stamps, right, on all of the pamphlets and all of the press. It has to get approved, right, before it goes out to the public. So it's all very highly censored and really managed. So moving forward through history, right, we have coming up in the fall, we have the Pilgrims, right, Thanksgiving coming up, coming over to the U.S. for religious freedom. Religious expression, communication, thought to have been so important, right? People are willing to travel across the oceans, right, for that. So we start to see America start to develop and push away, right, push back against some of this control from England and a lot of these laws, this oversight. We see developments of the Stamp Act and other types of acts trying to separate and get more control of their own destiny as Americans. And we see the development of an amazing postal system. Actually, our postal system was the first system that was what we would call a network system. Not like prior systems, which were like a bicycle wheel. We call it a wheel and spoke, where all the mail would have to go through the central office. So it would have to go through Paris, or all the mail would go through London. So in the United States, we had a postal system where you could send letters directly to your cousin or whoever you wanted to in other areas of the developing 13 colonies. And so, so we had this great growth in the US of communication, very high literacy rates, and really helped give a great kickstart to America during this important time of development. So journalism comes from this desire to know, this desire to have information and know what's going on, and really to connect citizens to a largely political world. We have high values in political speech and social speech. Today, political speech is one of the most protected types of communication. So a lot of times people are saying, how do these politicians get away with all this mudslinging at each other, or saying these things that are fact-checked and they're not true, things like that, right? Political speech in our country is so protected that it's very hard to prosecute. So and a good example is that every public official, when they begin their post in office, right, they get sworn in, right, and they now, from that moment forward, embody that position, right? They are now a public official, and they're not going to be 100% right all the time, right? So they might make mistakes, right? They're doing all sorts of work, and from that moment forward, they are in that official capacity, right? So it's very hard to prosecute political figures, political officials, because as soon as they're sworn in, you know, they're embodying what that is. So it's hard to prosecute political officials, and also the press. If the press repeats facts or things that a politician says, but they turn out to be wrong, the press can't be prosecuted for that, because as long as they do their due diligence, there's really only two ways that the press could be prosecuted for having wrong information. And one is either through malicious intent, and that's for public officials and public office holders. If the press maliciously, purposely is going after someone for that, or gross negligence. So if the press didn't do, like, just completely ignored facts or didn't even try to get the right information. Right? So those are really the only two cases that the press could be prosecuted for covering some of that information. So that's how special and how important and protected political speech is in a good way, but also you can get away with a lot too, right? So it's this balance of our founding fathers wanting so much freedom, right, coming from a more oppressive, right, a monarchy, right, type of government, wanting to ensure we have all of these rights, but it's kind of a trade-off too in some ways, right? So all kind of harking back to the very historical context, right? Here's some philosophers here. It's a little hard to read maybe, but I'll read one of my favorites and quotes, one of my favorite quotes that kind of talks about politics and the press and that relationship. This is from Thomas Jefferson. He says, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." So this is how important the press is. Even Thomas Jefferson is saying he would prefer the press over politics if we had to choose between one or the other. So that's how important that is. And of course, I like to brag about this all the time. I know UW-Whitewater is known for business and a lot of great things, but coming from the communication department, I always like to say, well, communication, the press, is so important, it's in the Constitution. And more than that, it's in the very first amendment, the very first one. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, to protest, to complain, right? Yeah, so that's how important it is, right? That's how important communication and the First Amendment is. So jump forward 100 years to, let's say, the late 1800s, and news is now a big business, right? It's lots of newspapers, lots of penny presses and diamond nickel presses, right? The cheap journalism, lots of sensationalism, right? Lots of stories about crime and sex and scandal, right? And things like that. Things that can sell a lot of papers, right? Make a buck. And so this is a period of time we call yellow journalism. So this is the yellow journalism time, kind of more focused on the industry and making money. And so in response to this, in the early 1900s, and really progressing through the rest of the 1900s, is we see the establishment of this progressive era. This return to understanding the importance of how important the press is for democracy and for politics, and we need to reform it, right? So the 1900s is kind of a time of reform, and where we try to think about how we can not just make money through journalism, but make people better citizens through it, educate people, not just have stories in there that's more entertainment, but more informative, right? And so we see the professionalization of the field. We see the establishment of schools of journalism. Now today, like myself, you can even get a PhD, right, in journalism. So we start to see norms and standards set in the industry and the development of societies that oversee ethics and make sure that policies are being followed correctly, right? So lots of establishment of journalism schools and these professional norms. So we can think about what we want journalism to be then as an institution, and particularly in terms of democracy and politics, right? We want it to act kind of like the fourth estate, if you've heard that phrase before. We have our executive branch, our judicial branch, and our legislative branch, right? So those are the three estates. And then often the press is thought of as the fourth estate. So the fourth one kind of representing the everyday people, acting on behalf of the little guy, making sure that big business, big politics are working for us, right? Working for us, the average everyday citizen, the way that we need it to be. So all of these reforms result in some different legislations and things as also new technologies emerge over time. So of course radio becomes a really popular medium in the mid 20th century. So we have the Radio Act, and this made sure that there was that public good. There was what we call a public interest, right? So there was this public interest mandate that the government said, hey, if you want to own a radio station, you can't just be giving out entertainment all the time or serial soap operas that people would listen to on the radio. People were really concerned about what was happening over the radio during this time. It was the first time kind of a major media came into the home, right, and was around children and right, wanted to make sure that this was working correctly. So this public interest mandate made sure that there was some good news, some good information, maybe some classical music, not just the pop music of the time, things like that. So, and it actually has to do with physics a little bit, right? So there's, on the electromagnetic spectrum, the radio waves, right, that are flowing through the air all around us, there's only so many channels you can have on that spectrum, right? It's limited. So the government said, hey, if you want to own one of these dots on the electromagnetic spectrum, you got to have something good in here for the people, right? It can't just be to make money. So that kind of starts some of this, some of these reforms, some of this legislation, some other things. Newspapers don't have to be licensed, but radio stations do. And then as TV stations develop, TV stations also have to be licensed. If you're a fan of, what was it, George Carlson, his 7 Deadly Sins, right? Words you can't say over the air, right? So there are some rules and some regulations and things. A TV station and a newspaper can't be owned by the same person in a county. So some things like that to make sure there's lots of different views, different ownership, and different ways of getting information and different types of information out there. So we see this kind of occur over time. And television follows this model as well. So follows this public interest mandate, especially on network TV, making sure we have that morning news, your lunchtime, and your evening dinner hour news, right? So again, it's not just entertainment all the time, but something good for you. So we have the emergence of the big three, NBC, ABC, CBS for radio. And then over by the end of the 20th century, we had, of course, adding in PBS, and then Fox News as well, right? So those are kind of our local broadcast TV stations, right? That a lot of us use, right? PBS is interesting, of course, and National Public Radio, because that does have some government funding, right? Government subsidies, and of course donations from viewers like you. Right? So there's a lot of good quality programming on there. It's not as, it didn't go through the commercialization like the other TV stations did or other media of what we would think of as action news, right? So kind of the 80s time when there's a lot of action reporting and this kind of more exciting, right, types of things. So it's a bit of a different model, but still part of that big five. So of course then by the end of the 20th century we have cable and we have satellite TV. When you buy those, you kind of agree to those user agreements. So there's no public interest mandate that they have to have news on any of the channels, as you may know. Some are just pure entertainment. And then others, of course, we do have some more opinionated news, right? And some things like that going on. CNN was the very first cable news network. That's what it stands for, right? Came onto the scene covering the first Iraq War, 24 hours a day. So kind of really groundbreaking in that sense. And then now today we have some other cable channels as well, of course, right? We have Fox News on the right, and then we have MSNBC on the left, right? And they're offering different types of products, right? So kind of, again, thinking in this business mindset, and I want to encourage us all to think about this, is that news is a business, right? It's not subsidized by the government. It's not for free. A lot of when we watch it on TV, when we hear it on the radio, we're either paying for it with our eyeballs through the advertisements that we see, or our cable subscriber, right? Spectrum or Warner, whoever your cable provider is, or things like that, right? That's who's getting a lot of that money. So news is a business. It has to offer different products. You can typically trust those 4 broadcast local TV stations, right? Those are giving you solid, just good news. But then when you do get into that cable realm, you have to offer a different type of product, right? So they're not going to try to compete with the big five that have been around for 100 years now, right? They're gonna offer something that's a little bit different. And often that is more opinion, it is more commentary, and it's for those folks who view the world in that type of way, right? Now then we move on for the internet, and we can throw ethics out the window, right, if we want to, right? There's really no regulation online of any of these media unless you're breaking, you know, some major, you know, cross-national laws or things like that, or child pornography is, you know, regulated online. But otherwise, it's the Wild West out there. So we need to be online, especially savvy. A lot of those professional newsmakers and organizations have online entities, and we can generally trust those pretty well. But when we get into social media, when we get into blogs, everyone could have a blog right now if you wanted to. You could get a free one online, right? Those are things we need to be more careful about because we don't know if the people making or sharing that information went through journalism school or really went through the education and the training to be able to be talking, you know, this way or to be sharing this information. So that's where we are today. We're in the 21st century here. Lots of internet, lots of mobile media, lots of social media. And we still want journalism, though, to do what it always has been, right? We want it to be a public forum, just kind of in a different way, to inform the media, to mobilize it, to kind of serve as an agenda setter. What are the top most important things that are important in our country today or for our county or our city? To investigate public problems and solutions, and to be a watchdog for the public, right? So to be that kind of voice that can represent the little guy, the average person. So still wanting journalism to do those things, but just in a very different way today. There are some dangers in journalism today, both in our country and across the world. We're fighting for a free press. Today there are more classified documents, more closed meetings, more slap suits or lawsuits designed to just drag out over time and basically try to bankrupt the other party or try to get to a settlement to basically kind of silence whatever the other party or what's going on. So those are some things happening in the US. And then around the world, there are still lots of state-run media ran by countries that are producing a lot of propaganda, was what we might call it still. There's limited internet and even physical harm. A couple examples. I was at a conference a couple years ago in Singapore, and one night I was online, you know, looking around, checking the news and things like that. And the next morning I went back on my laptop again and went to go look at some more things, and sure enough, they had already shut down my access to some of these websites. So before, not even 24 hours later, already my internet was being restricted. So, and I do highly, it was a great country, I recommend visiting it, but I was really surprised. Like, very quickly, they limited my access to certain websites. This here is a picture of James Foley. He went to school at Marquette. He unfortunately died a few years ago covering the Syrian war. He was beheaded during that conflict. So journalists do actually have a risk to their lives in covering some of these things on an international level. So the importance of freedom of information, the importance of democracy, and a lot of these core American values are really important to the press working them and influence a lot of politics and political communication today. And so that's the next part of what we'll talk about is what politics kind of looks like today in the press and also what we want it to be too. So this is kind of our transition here. Any questions or comments before we kind of move into the next phase here, into the next step of kind of politics today? Pretty good? Are we tracking all right? Okay, I know I'm moving along pretty quick here. So trying to give you a crash course a little bit in some history and some politics. Yeah. So, all right, so let's talk politics now. Oh, yeah, right there.
Is there any difference between what's news and what's commentary?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. So, Yep. Something students a lot of times, I'll just give an example when they're writing a news story. A lot of times at the end, they like to editorialize. So they try to say, what does this mean? Or what should we take away from covering this event or covering this issue? And so I always write on that paper, don't editorialize, right? We're supposed to tell people the facts and give the information, but we're not supposed to tell them what to think or how to think. Right? That's not the job of the journalist. So talking heads, political commentators, right? Yeah, the opinion section on royalpurplenews.com. Yes, that's where you put the opinion, right? And the commentary. But that's going to be biased, right? It's going to have people's viewpoints in it and the way that they perceive the world. And so that's important. It's an important distinction. So I mentioned those cable channels earlier, who typically more lean toward the right or toward the left. Right? During the times when we have normal news on our classic broadcast channels, right, in the morning, noon, before dinner, and later at night, those are the times of day when those political commentators are on the cable news channels. So if I'm watching news on CBS at 6 o'clock, and then I flip over to Fox News or MSNBC, that's when they're going to have their political commentary on. So they're kind of on the reverse schedule of the rest of the broadcast news. So that's great if that's the type of viewpoint and commentary and opinions you want to receive. Just know that when you flip over from the news at this time on the broadcast TV, when you flip over to cable, they're offering a different product. Right? They're offering something different. Yeah, way in the back.
Does public radio or public television have laws governing what they do, or is their neutrality just part of their culture?
Mm-hmm. Really great question. And you'll see at the very end that there are various organizations that provide guidelines, accreditations, oversight, and have advisory boards. So there are advisory boards for Wisconsin Public Radio and NPR and things like that, but no actual specific legislation. Actually, my professor, he's passed on now, but Jack Mitchell was the co-founder of NPR and the founder of the All Things Considered. If you're curious in that area, he's written a couple great books. So yeah, if you're interested about kind of the rise of public media in the U.S. So, but again, then and that's kind of is similar to England in that the BBC is government subsidized. Every time you buy a radio or a TV or a media appliance in England, a little piece of that goes to support the BBC. So in the U.S. we do have the PBS and NPR, but otherwise the rest is all commercially run. So always either then off subscribers or your eyeballs, those ads. All right, so kind of brought up this idea of opinion and things just a minute ago. So let's talk about objectivity. And I guess I'm going to kind of do a little bit of some theorizing with you all, some philosophy. And I want to ask you all, do you think anybody could ever be truly objective? Is it possible? Maybe we can think, we've got the holidays coming up, you go to your Thanksgiving dinner, your Christmas dinner, you have those debates, maybe sometimes they get uncomfortable, right? That's a good question. Can anyone ever be truly objective? Right? We have such important values, ideals, fields of experience, which is basically how we grew up, how we've seen life, that impacts the way we view the world. It's very hard, I think, for any of us to be truly objective. Okay? That's often why we love science, we love math, numbers that seem concrete, that you can't argue with this, right? But maybe a sentence you could argue with, right? But there's a great debate about whether objectivity is even possible, and whether we should hold the news to that high level of a standard. Many of us might remember in the 20th century, most towns had at least 2 newspapers. And typically one leaned more to the right and one leaned more to the left, right? So Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, there was the Milwaukee Journal, there was the Milwaukee Sentinel, right? Even my small hometown of Tomah, Wisconsin, we had the Tomah Journal and the Tomah Monitor Herald, right? And so this was the way it was in a lot of communities across the US. It wasn't until around the 80s when a lot of the big mergers and acquisitions in media happened and basically merged and combined these. And then now we kind of have this higher goal of objectivity. And so I want to talk about the news in that way, and particularly with politics, and that objectivity is a goal. It's maybe a utopian view, a utopian ideal that we strive for as professionals. But it's a good question about whether that is truly attainable. But it doesn't mean that the effort isn't noble, right? It's a noble effort. So there are ways that the news tries to make sure that it's objective. Just like in science, we do kind of have our own scientific method. So we want to make sure we have sources from both sides of the story, right? Often there are even more than two sides of the story. We can cover those, include those we want to. Maybe we want a third source who's an expert on the subject, but not connected to the subject, so they're an outside expert, so we know that they won't be biased. A lot of times we'll want the viewpoint, the opinion of a citizen or someone affected by the issue. So again, someone who's not maybe right in that debate, but could be affected by it. So we want to make sure we have good sources. We want to make sure we do our research. We want to make sure we have quotes from those different viewpoints. Again, we want to make sure we don't editorialize. We don't try to put a nice bow on the story and wrap it up nicely to give to people. We just want to give them the information and let them decide how to wrap that up. So we do have our own formats, our different writing formats for how we write different types of stories and things like that. This isn't just creative writing, sit down and write whatever you want, though creativity is great. We do need to give a little bit of infotainment in there, right? A little bit of pizzazz to compete with a lot of other media, a lot of the other entertainment that's out there. So we need to make it enjoyable. Has to be a good read, or has to be an enjoyable program to tune into, right? But we're going to still try to really focus on facts and strive for that objectivity. So these next couple slides are kind of about how ways we can easily obtain that objectivity, and then some ways that we can't. So a good thing is that there is no reliance on government funding or subsidies unless you're with the PBS or NPR, right? So there can be some distance there, right? We can be a bit critical of politics and government and not worry about advertising influencing that. Media are private or publicly held companies. Some newspapers are owned by dynastic families. Others are publicly held. So that's kind of the business models there. There is what we call an editorial wall. So there's literally back in the 20th century at your local newspaper, the editorial department is on one side, there's a wall, and the business department is over on the other side to make sure the money doesn't affect the content, right? And that's something that still is still true today, and we really try to make sure that that's important, so the big money doesn't impact the content. Typically, studies find that executives, owners of media, do lean a bit more conservative. They're business owners. And then the journalists do lean a bit more liberal, so they kind of balance each other out pretty good. On a global scale, American media is slightly more conservative than kind of the true middle of the row. So a little bit more conservative than a lot of our European counterparts. There are some stereotypes about how journalism is great, and stereotypes about how it can be negative. Here it's kind of hard to see, but I've got Peter Parker over here, right? He's a photojournalist, right, in pop media culture. Superman, Clark Kent, right? He's a journalist, right? Here got Vicky Vale from Batman, if you remember that movie from the 80s. The Ninja Turtles, right? So media is really involved a lot also in pop culture and has some good stereotypes. There are though some bad ones too. Ideas like paparazzi and being too nosy, right? Things like that. But there are privacy laws, and private facts information laws that media follow. So typically overall, you can count on the media that is covering a lot of these issues. They have a right to know. They're striving for that public interest. Right? Public officials and celebrities, they make their money off of being in the public eye, right? So whenever I'll say whenever I hear people criticize, say, oh, this, people love to shoot the messenger, right? As the saying goes, don't shoot the messenger. Well, they always do, right? But those people, they're making their money off of being in the public eye, and they're very protected for doing that. As I said, it's particularly if you're a politician, you have a lot more protections with that political speech. So similarly, the press also has a lot of protections in covering these things because it's our job to cover these newsmakers, these movers and shakers. So it is an industry. There's different types of news. Couple points here too. Some people might say media spin stories, right? You've probably heard that phrase. If you ask a journalist, they'll tell you the public relations folks are the ones doing the spinning, okay? The strategic communicators. Every organization today has some sort of a public relations entity to it, whether it's one person or an entire department. It's their job to make sure that the communication representing that organization is always right on key and sending the message that the organization wants to be out there. So it's very hard today for journalists to kind of get unprepared or or information or quotes that don't have that spin, right? That aren't pre-prepared knowing that that's going to go out there in the media. So it makes the journalist's job harder to try to get that kind of unadulterated or unfiltered information that maybe was easier to get back in the 20th century. One final point here is also kind of a challenge, but something that those in the industry and scholars know about is what we call the hostile media effect. And this is particularly relevant for politics. Studies show that we can have 2 news articles with perfect balance on both sides, conservative, liberal, same amount of quotes, same amount of sources, and people will still walk away thinking that it's biased against their viewpoint. So that's how important politics is to us, and these viewpoints of what we think society should be and our values and things, that even with in an experimental setting, again, perfectly set up articles, completely balanced, people will still come away thinking that, no, it's biased against me or it's biased against my side. So that's it's interesting, some food for thought there. Here's kind of a neat infographic here about the major media companies in the US and the world, really. These are multinational world conglomerates. And this is maybe a potential criticism of media, in that there really are just 6 major media that own about 90% of all communication media in the US. And so this isn't just news, this is also entertainment, okay? So General Electric, News Corp, Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, CBS. These are all huge corporations, conglomerates, that own tons of media. But not just media, they're also invested in lots of other things, right? So General Electric, of course, right? We might know that from our appliances. They're also very active in the defense industry. They make missiles, they make weapons. So if you hear people say like, oh, this media organization is biased this way, or this one's that way, or this way, if they're biased to anything, it's biased to the almighty dollar. it's biased just wanting to make money and be these big conglomerate media organizations. They're not trying to rock the boat politically one way or the other, really. That's not their stake for these organizations. And that's why we call it mass media. It's media for the masses. Share a couple kind of funny off-color jokes for you a bit. In the industry, ABC, for example, so ABC, it's owned by Disney. Disney also owns ESPN, Marvel, Miramax. They did just acquire the other year 20th Century Fox, so the entertainment arm of Fox, not the news, but the entertainment. But so in the industry, we kind of joke, ABC stands for anything but controversy. So it's Disney, it's happy, you know, they're giving you the good information you need for the day, they're giving you happy talk in the morning. I love the morning shows, you know, they have some nice banter, get us going, give us the good facts, right? But they're not going to be biased to one side or the other. Kind of similarly, CBS, we kind of joke that it's the Caucasian Broadcasting Syndicate, right? So it's vanilla, right? Again, they're not rocking the boat. They're not doing, you know, any types of crazy news, right? I love CBS. I love Sunday mornings and 60 Minutes and all that good stuff. So, but you don't have to really worry about, again, these unless they're really out there and they're saying, yes, our organization leans to the right, and this we lean to the left, right? With those cable channels. Otherwise, you know, you don't have to worry about these. Don't let maybe the politicians, you know, shoot the media, you know, like they do. Blame the media for a lot of these things. So how do we determine what's the news then, right? So those are maybe some things that you might be wondering. How we do that is we think about whether something is newsworthy or not, right? There's only so much time in that half-hour local broadcast or that half-hour national broadcast or so much space in our newspaper. Great thing about the internet, the article can be as long as you need it to be now these days, which is nice. But we have news values that help us determine whether or not something should be covered. One is timeliness, so it does have to be new, has to be recent. Impact, does it impact a lot of people? Is this something that a lot of people will care about or not? Prominence, so is this a prominent issue, something that people care about, or is it a prominent person, something that people want to know about? A good example I share is, people get COVID these days. Someone gets COVID, it doesn't make the news. But was it a year ago Jill Biden got COVID? You know, it made the news, right? So it's because she's prominent, right? She's a prominent person. Proximity, so what's the literal geographic location of this issue? Is it something important to Wisconsin or important to southeastern Wisconsin that we might care about or not? Singularity, that's also uniqueness, so something maybe really unique, really different, special. And finally, conflict. Right? Conflict is of course a big issue. You may have heard the phrase in the past, if it bleeds, it leads, maybe, right? So, you know, something that's kind of really shaking things up might be a good story, right? This kind of harkens back to that yellow journalism era when we were trying to make those dollars and, oh, this will be a big splash on the headlines, sell a lot of papers, things like that, right? But really today we've moved away from that and we're more focused not on problems, but trying to be, as an industry, more focused on the solutions, and so that people aren't so cynical about politics and the press and things like that and society in general. And we're trying to really be more solution oriented. So, and for politics, I'll say what's interesting and a reason, kind of ask you to think outside the box or a little deeper, is a reason a conflict in politics, say between two legislators that are kind of fighting in the press about an issue, right? For a journalist, it's not necessarily that that's going to make good headlines, why we would publish it. It's because those legislators represent real citizens, and so their concerns are supposed to represent large populations of people. And if those two legislators are willing to kind of go to battle in the public eye and to fight it out in the media, then this must be something pretty important, right? This must be a pretty important issue to the populations that they represent. And so yes, it probably might make good TV or might make a good headline or things, but really the idea is that if it's worth enough, if it's worthy enough for them to publicly kind of argue about this or debate this, then it must be something pretty important to the people that they represent. So that's maybe a different way of thinking about controversy, conflict. It's less maybe about the sensationalism and more about what really is happening here. Here's a good way of thinking about the role of journalism and also its kind of relation to politics. I like to use this dog kind of metaphor. I talked before about journalism being the fourth estate, right? Being kind of a watchdog for the people, right? So we want journalism to be a watchdog on behalf of all of us, make sure our government and our economy is working the way we need it to. We want it to be a hunting dog. I think about, the classic investigative journalism of the late 20th century and, doing the work for us. We're all leading busy lives. We have jobs and other things going on. So this is how journalists and the press, they're supposed to look into these things for us, so we don't have to, right? We're raising families or doing other things, right? So it's their job to do this, right? We don't want the press to be a lapdog, right? We don't want it to be a lapdog to big business or to big government. We don't want it to get too close to those things, so that it can be independent and it can work for us and not be affected by those. We do want journalism to be top dogs, right? We want to be the top dog. We want our station to be the #1 on the story, the first one on the scene, the first one to cover those things, to be known for different types of things, different types of covering this issue, this breaking news, right, story that came up. The problem is we are living in a 24-hour world these days. Anything can be published on the internet at any time. Stories are popping up and happening all the time. Sometimes rush to be first. Sometimes our goal is to be the top dog. Maybe sometimes we miss some things then, or some mistakes get made. And so we need to be careful. It's great to be the top dog, but you want to make sure that you're not overlooking things on your way to get there. So, and then pack journalism. Pack journalism is a real term, something that we do talk about. There's kind of a Washington, D.C. pack of media. There are different types of journalists and types of news and out there. In recent years, some presidents have denied some media organizations from covering them, right? So we want to be in the pack, maybe covering politics like DC and everything happening there, but we also want to be careful too. We don't kind of get in this pack mindset. So some things we want to think about for all of us now when we're consuming the news, when we're consuming political information particularly, is some things for different specific media, but also just overall. We want to think about who's the intended audience for this. Remember, this is it is news. It is for the good of us, public interest, right? For the public good, but it is also a business. So they're creating something that is going to appeal to their intended audience. So we want to think about who's the audience for this. We can think about commercial versus public media. And online, this is important too. There are a lot of nonprofit media online as well, and reports that we receive that maybe fall outside the lines of kind of the typical traditional professional media we might think about. So we want to be sure to click on those about pages to look into who's funding this, or who's paying for this website or this organization. What might be some of their goals that might affect the information or the reports or things that we're reading or listening or hearing to. And then I said earlier this already, timing matters with our television, and the type of programming matters, right? Those opinion leaders, those talking heads, they're offering a different type of information that also is a lot of entertainment factor going into those too. And then for the internet, as I said, it's kind of the Wild West out there. We want to be really careful. Even our friends on social media, they're not maybe maliciously sending you misinformation, but they might be passing it along without knowing it themselves, right? So we just want to be really careful online in particular. These are the logos for a lot of these press organizations that help make sure that the industry is operating the way that we want it to. There aren't a lot of legal laws that dictate what the press can do too much, but we do have a lot of these organizations and societies that provide accreditations and standards for media organizations. So here you can see On a national level, we have the National Press Association, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. So those are along the bottom there. And then up here in Wisconsin, we've got the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association, the Wisconsin Newspaper Association, and the Milwaukee Press Club. So these are some important organizations that make sure that media is meeting the standards that we want it to. And I would say if you're consuming media that isn't a member of some of these organizations, isn't accredited through them, doesn't go through annual checkups and participate in their events and their conferences, their annual educations and things like that, then you might want to consider exploring some other options out there. Little side note, if anyone's ever been to the Newsroom Pub in downtown Milwaukee, I definitely recommend you go there. That's the current kind of home base for the Milwaukee Press Club. Used to be kind of a much larger club. Today it's still where they hold all of their events and things. It's really neat, right on the river, and they have signatures from past presidents from early 1900s up through today, and lots of famous folks that have come through there, and it's a really historic building. And I really recommend you go and visit that. It's actually really neat. So the Milwaukee Press Club is the longest continuously running press club in the United States, so since 1885. So journalism really is an American institution. It's always been highly intertwined with politics because politics, free speech is so important to us as a nation. And we'll see how things happen through the rest of the 21st century. It's an exciting time and an important time for American media. So I hope that gave you a little bit of some information there.